Good morning. I'm Brian Tarallo. I'm an instructor and a facilitator, and I'm very happy to introduce you to Rae Ringel. She's been coaching me to bring my instruction online, and she's shared such great advice that we wanted to share it with you. So Rae Ringel is a certified executive coach, and she's the founding president of the Ringel Group. She's a faculty member at Georgetown University's Institute for Transformational Leadership, and she's the founding director of their certificate program in the art of facilitation and design. She's also an adjunct faculty at the University of Maryland Robert H. Smith School of Business. So Rae, I'm having a hard time shifting to teaching online. I'm comfortable in the room, but this has been a challenge. Do you have any advice?
Yes. So first of all, to all you teachers and educators out there, I want to say thank you and bravo for your unbelievable ability to pivot and flex during this unique moment in time and do share all of your gifts with your students in this virtual space. So for me, first and foremost, I'm a big believer that the inner game runs the outer game, and how we feel on the inside and how we think really impacts all the behaviors and actions that we choose. So I always start with this idea of mindset. So many of you have been teaching for so long and have really mastered your craft in the classroom, and it's a real shift to think about delivering content in this way. The most important thing to remember from the beginning is that it's not going to be the same, but that doesn't mean that it has to be worse. It's just going to be different. And I think the acceptance of it's not going to be the same in the classroom, it is going to be different, but it doesn't need to be worse. If we can really lean into that and embrace that, it can open up different channels of creativity and what we actually can do. I think for many people right now, they're just feeling the loss of what we had and what we don't have right now. So it's hard to really lean into all the tools and opportunities that we can do online. So if we just sort of start with that mindset shift, it will open up a lot more possibilities. And then we can really start talking about specific design tools and techniques to deliver this content in a really engaging way.
So it's more about the mindset then. What would you say to that point? What would you say is the best way to show up to teach?
So I do think that we need practices always when we're showing up into rooms, whether they're real rooms or virtual rooms, and thinking about how do we make those transition points between what we were doing before and what we were doing after. Now, I imagine for many teachers and educators right now, by the time you get online to start teaching, you may have had a whole world already in your morning: childcare, pet care. It could be a storm in your house before you even have to start teaching. So how can you create some intentional space between what you were doing before you start teaching and then entering the classroom? It could be as simple as eating a good breakfast, taking a walk, taking some deep breaths. Maybe you have some sort of mindful practice. How can you engage in even the smallest amount of self-care before you get online to do a full day of output and presence for your students? So making sure that you feel okay and charged is not only going to help you show up better, but that will translate to your students. So they will really feed off of your body language and your energy. So what might be your practice that you can do right now to really show up as your best self?
One of the things that's really important to me in terms of showing up as my best self is how I enter into the room. How do I create a space for others for learning? Do you have any ideas around that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because I think that sometimes we forget that a platform like Zoom is actually a room. It is a classroom. So we're not walking into a physical space, but it's not just a series of pictures that are on a screen. That is actually a room, and we have to create that container and that space for the room. So really thinking about, how do you actually enter the room and start? It's not about getting online and just diving into content. It's about really welcoming students, making sure that every voice is heard, whether it's every student writing something in chat, or it's literally taking each student off mute to have them say something, or sometimes it's by changing their name tag that's on their box. But it's a way of really welcoming students into that space and letting them know what they're going to be working on during that day. More than ever, when you're creating spaces online, we have to tell people, tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them, and then tell them what you told them. You have to really make the case for people's attention. So by entering the room, welcoming everyone, and let them know what the objectives are and what they're going to be learning, you are more likely to really grab their attention and hook them into focus right from the beginning if you give them a roadmap for where you're going.
Yeah, that's helpful. The other thing related to that I'm a little concerned about is that it's one thing when I'm talking to human beings, it's very artificial when I'm talking to a piece of plastic in class and the camera. And I'm concerned about how I'm showing up on camera. Any ideas?
Yeah, so I think that, first of all, a lot of people say they love facilitating on Zoom because you can facilitate in your pajamas. I'm not a fan of the pajamas, even from the pajamas on the bottom, because then if you stand up and forget, it's a mess. So first and foremost, think about how you would show up in the classroom. How would you want to look in the classroom? What's going to make you feel professional? What's going to make you feel like you're on your game when you are actually teaching? So you want to feel good when you're actually teaching. And then in terms of showing up, people are really susceptible to distraction on Zoom. So whereas in the classroom, I might look away to think about something and come back, or I might look down and then come back, people are much more sensitive in camera to that looking away. So you really do want to try and focus and be animated to the actual camera. That means looking at your camera as opposed to looking at your students. When you're looking at your students, you're actually not looking at your students, you're looking down. So try to make sure that your head is level to the camera. I've seen with some of my children's teachers that even the slightest shift of the camera, it might be that they're looking up at their face. How do you try and be eye to eye with your students? I think that makes a really big difference. And the other thing is to remember that even though we only have this one box, there's a lot of physical presence that you can have online. You can have hand gestures and arm gestures and shoulders and facial expressions. You can adjust your camera so you can be standing up and you'll have more physical presence and posture. I was told the other day that I love thinking about eyebrows and how you can express yourself through eyebrows. And one of my students said, yeah, I mean, glasses are the performance stage for your eyebrows. And I thought that is one of the greatest things I've ever heard. So the idea is, and we'll talk more about this later in a later session when we talk about design and content, but if you're gonna, our recommendation is to do 50% of your normal content, 50% less, but actually have 50% more presence, more animation, more engagement, more passion to really make sure that your students are staying engaged.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of presence and animation, I've heard that I have something of a quiet voice. Do you have any tips around that?
Yeah, sure. It's not about actually getting so much louder or amping up your microphone so much. There are people who will be more quiet talkers. And what I would say is it's more about the energy and the excitement in your voice than how loud it is and how big you're modulating. So if you have a quieter voice, I would say lean in a bit more to your microphone and just really think about your cadence and your rhythm. Are you going up at certain times? Are you going down at certain times? Maybe you're a bit louder, but then you come back and be quiet. So it's not about transforming your voice, but it's actually about infusing your voice with something that's interesting, less about volume and more about mixing it up a bit. Imagine, I like to tell teachers and actually presenters sometimes as a vocal warm-up, I have adults just read children's books to their peers as if they were reading to a group of kindergartners. How would you read this book? How would you make this book come alive? And it's amazing how the tone of their voice shifts when they're reading a children's book. Then I say, read the children's book and now go out and do your presentation. They're not louder, they're just more connected to the content and more, their voice automatically becomes more engaging.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the content, I've noticed that my lesson plans can be pretty full, and I'm having a hard time getting through everything that I want to cover unless I'm lecturing the whole time.
Yeah. So there is a pretty limited attention span that we have in general, and it becomes less and less. While it's wonderful that we're doing all this online learning, there are days where kids have been on Zoom until 3:30 or even 4 o'clock. So just speaking directly to get all the content in is actually going to dilute the power of the lesson because it'll be harder for people to get engaged. We'll talk more about this in the design module, but just a couple of quick tips for now. I say with content, whatever you were going to do in the room, when you're doing it in a lesson online, you probably have to cut it by about 50% because you have to give students more time to engage in the material, both turning their camera off and doing some work alone, or maybe even in breakout rooms. You will eventually get to all the work, but just talking at the students is not working. So really allow yourself to think about your lesson plan more as interval training. So when you think about exercise, some people like to go for a 30-minute run or a 45-minute run, maybe an hour if you're super ambitious. But in terms of what's best for your body, it's actually better to do 10 minutes of running and a couple of minutes of walking, 10 minutes of running and a couple of minutes of walking to really allow your body to go forward and then also to rest. Let's think about our brains. How can you be speaking in 10 to 15-minute intervals and no more before your students have to either speak or practice something or do something on their own? Give them that break, give their eyes a rest, and then go back into the content. So you can get to all the content, but you just need to break it up in different and more creative ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that idea of the interval training. One of the things I've been noticing is at the end of the day, I'm feeling drained, and I'm seeing it in my students too.
Yeah. So I think that's a real challenge right now is, are we losing kids in the back end of the training day, right? So what's actually happening between 1 and 3 o'clock is really challenging. So I think that really be mindful of what you're asking them to do during lunch, what you're asking them to do during breaks, and what are you doing for yourself during that time? Are they doing any sort of physical activity? And that doesn't mean just having gym or recess, but literally doing any sort of physical activity where they're getting up from their chair, where they're moving around. I think our designs have to be really, really carefully crafted on the back end, the post-lunch. As we all know, post-lunch, the blood from our head drops down to our stomach to digest, and that's when we can start feeling woozy, and same for us. So how do we make especially the afternoon sessions a lot more active? And how do we also allow students in the afternoon to turn off their cameras and do some asynchronistic work just to kind of be on their own rhythm and their own time?
Well, Rae, this has been great. Is there any other advice that you might have?
I would say for this piece on presence, what's really important right now is in the moment of teaching, how can you also what we call kind of get up on the balcony and really start observing first how you're showing up, where your energy is tracking in the morning, midday, afternoon, and also just starting to observe what's happening with your students, what's working, where they tend to be really engaged, where they're asking a lot of questions, where there's quiet and you're working really hard to get anyone to participate. What I like to do is have a notebook right by my side and just be jotting down notes all day, looking for patterns and rhythms of what are the peaks where we're really rolling, and where are some of the valleys where I feel like I'm working extra hard to engage people, and just start tracking that for myself and noticing. This is the time right now to really get into the laboratory and start noticing what's working both for you as an educator and what's working for students. The other piece of advice that I would have is we really need to support each other during this moment, helping each other come up with new tools, new modalities, new ways of designing your lessons that you haven't done before. And there's so many people, the two of us, we have so many colleagues, and you have each other to really help you think about taking the content that you need to transmit and transport to your students and making it come alive in a way that maybe you've never even tried before. There are many students who are actually thriving in this environment. It's quieter for them. They don't have the distraction of the classroom. For some, it's harder. But I think we actually have ways to connect to many different kinds of learners through this medium. But we need each other to be thought partners around this and constantly be brainstorming and thinking about this idea of conversion, of what happens in the classroom and how we creatively convert it to the online space.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rae, thank you so much. What else do you have coming up that we can look forward to?
Well, we have a 4-part series coming up for you that we're really excited to reveal. Our next episode is going to be focused purely on design. How many people are in the room? How do you break up those numbers? What kind of timing should you use? What are some of the ways that you can pad your time and build in more time for kids to connect and absorb the materials? So it's not the same conversion of what I did in the room, I'm just doing online. We have to do a different kind of design approach. So we're really going to get into some of the technical design features. Our next episode after that, episode 3, is going to be tools for engagement. We'll talk about Zoom. We'll talk about Google Docs. We'll talk about Mural, which is an online collaborative platform that kids are having a great time with and doing some amazing projects together. Really going to dig into lots of different modalities that you can use on Zoom, both some of your basic features and some really innovative techniques to get kids to collaborate and do project work together online. And then finally, our 4th episode is going to be focused on reading the room, or what I love to call the joy of working with people. And that is really about what happens when there's breakdowns. How do you turn a breakdown to a breakthrough? Or what if there's bad behavior or distractions? How do you diagnose what's going on? What are appropriate interventions? What needs to happen in the moment? What needs to happen offline? What do we need to do to effectively understand what's happening in our classroom? And how do the interventions change online when we want to turn disruption into something that can actually be productive and keep our community and our classes healthy and intact?
I can't wait. Well, Rae, thank you so much for this, and looking forward to next time. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you amazing educators for providing this online space for your students.